42 years on this bench have taught me that the phrase "I'll have your badge by tomorrow" is one of the most common threats spoken in the heat of a traffic stop, and also, in my experience, one of the least accurate predictions a person can make about their own immediate future. And the morning a woman named Vanessa Pruitt walked into my courtroom on a charge of assaulting a police officer, having said exactly those words to a 26-year-old patrol officer named Marcus Webb roughly 40 seconds before she shoved him hard enough to send him stumbling backward into his own patrol vehicle, I understood almost immediately that this case was going to hinge entirely on a small rectangular device clipped to Officer Webb's chest. A device that had captured, in exacting and unforgiving detail, every single second of an encounter. Vanessa Pruitt would spend the following 2 months trying to convince this court had unfolded very differently than it actually did. I want to walk through exactly what happened before I tell you what that bodycam footage revealed, because the full sequence of events matters enormously to understanding why a routine traffic stop over an expired registration ended with a woman facing felony charges she never once believed a person like her could face. The stop itself began on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon along Ridgeline Boulevard, where Officer Webb, 3 years into his career with the department and, according to his supervisor's testimony, one of the more even-tempered and procedurally careful officers on the force, ran a routine plate scan that flagged Vanessa Pruitt's silver SUV for an expired registration, 7 months expired, a violation that under normal circumstances results in nothing more dramatic than a citation and a polite reminder to visit the DMV. And I want to be direct about something here, because it matters enormously to everything that followed. Officer Webb's own bodycam footage, time-stamped and unedited, shows him approaching the vehicle with entirely standard courtesy, introducing himself, explaining the reason for the stop, and asking for license, registration, and proof of insurance in a tone that any reasonable person watching would describe as calm and entirely professional. Vanessa Pruitt, however, did not respond with anything resembling the same tone, and I want to share, because the footage itself would eventually become Exhibit A in this case and was played in its entirety in my courtroom, roughly how the encounter unfolded from that point forward. According to the timestamp on the recording, within 11 seconds of Officer Webb explaining the reason for the stop, Vanessa Pruitt's voice rises sharply, and she asks him, "Do you have any idea who I am?" A question Officer Webb answers, with what I found on review to be admirable restraint, by simply stating that regardless of who she was, the registration on her vehicle had expired and he needed to see her documents to proceed. A response that, rather than de-escalating the encounter, appeared to accelerate it considerably, because Vanessa Pruitt is heard on the recording informing Officer Webb that she serves on the city's Police Oversight and Accountability Commission, an appointed civilian board established 4 years earlier specifically to review complaints of officer misconduct and recommend disciplinary action, and that she personally, in her words captured clearly on the audio, has reviewed and voted on disciplinary matters for officers with considerably more seniority than him, and that continuing to detain her over what she called a paperwork technicality would be, and I am quoting directly from the transcript entered into evidence, the last mistake of his short career. I want to pause here because this detail, Vanessa Pruitt's actual position on the Police Oversight Commission, is what transformed this case from an unremarkable traffic stop dispute into something the district attorney's office treated with considerably more seriousness than a typical misdemeanor encounter, because a person appointed to a civilian board specifically created to hold officers accountable, invoking that very position as a threat during a routine stop, represents precisely the kind of institutional abuse of power the Oversight Commission itself was established to prevent, a fact not lost on anyone once this case became public. Officer Webb, according to the footage, continued to request her documents calmly, explaining that he was required to complete the stop regardless of any board position she held, at which point Vanessa Pruitt, still seated in her vehicle, informed him that she would be reporting him personally to the chief of police by the end of the day, and that she expected, and again I am quoting the transcript directly, to have his badge by tomorrow morning. A phrase that would eventually give this case its public nickname once local news picked up the story. At this point, roughly 90 seconds into the stop, Vanessa Pruitt exited her vehicle without being asked to, which itself represents a deviation from standard traffic stop procedure that immediately raised Officer Webb's degree of caution, a shift visible in his own posture on the footage. He asked her, clearly and calmly, to remain in her vehicle for both their safety, a request she did not comply with, instead walking directly toward him with her phone raised, filming, while continuing to state that she intended to have him removed from the force, and it was at this point, roughly 2 minutes and 11 seconds into the recording, that Vanessa Pruitt, standing now within roughly a foot of Officer Webb, reached out and shoved him with both hands, an action captured with complete clarity on the bodycam footage, sending him stumbling backward against the frame of his own patrol vehicle. An action Officer Webb responded to by taking a single step back, raising both hands and stating clearly on camera, "Ma'am, you just committed a battery on a police officer. I need you to place your hands behind your back," a directive Vanessa Pruitt did not comply with either, continuing instead to insist that she was a member of the Oversight Commission, and that he had no idea the mistake he was making, at which point Officer Webb, following what his supervisor would later testify was textbook de-escalation and restraint protocol, called for backup rather than attempting to physically restrain her alone, and waited calmly, continuing to request that she remain still, until a second officer arrived roughly 4 minutes later to assist with the arrest. Throughout the entirety of this 4-minute waiting period, captured continuously on the body cam, Vanessa Pruitt can be heard repeating variations of the same threat no fewer than 9 times, according to the transcript later entered into evidence by Priya Chun, the assistant district attorney assigned to prosecute the case. "I'll have your badge by tomorrow. You have no idea who you're dealing with. This is going to be the biggest mistake of your career, and I want to note, because it became relevant to my ruling, that at no point across this entire 4-minute recording did Officer Webb raise his own voice, use any language that could be characterized as disrespectful, or take any action beyond the single step backward he took after being shoved," which forensic use of force analysts, retained by the prosecution and cross-examined at length by Vanessa Pruitt's attorney, characterized as a textbook example of restrained, procedurally correct conduct under circumstances that would have justified considerably more forceful intervention. The hearing itself began on a Wednesday morning, and Vanessa Pruitt arrived dressed in a manner clearly intended to project civic authority rather than the casual attire she had actually been wearing on the day of the stop, a tailored blazer, reading glasses she did not appear to actually need, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the seal of the Police Oversight Commission itself, a choice her own attorney, a man named Douglas Farrow, would later admit under my questioning was made entirely at her own insistence and against his explicit advice. Farrow opened by requesting that the charges be reduced to a simple citation, characterizing the incident as, in his words, a heated exchange between 2 civil servants that escalated unfortunately on both sides, a framing I told him plainly, before the state had presented a single piece of evidence, that I found difficult to reconcile with felony assault on an officer. But I told him I intended to give him every opportunity to make that argument once the footage had been reviewed in full. Officer Webb took the stand first, and I want to describe his testimony because the composure he carried through it, 3 years into a career that had very nearly ended over a routine registration check, told me a great deal about the caliber of officer this city very nearly lost. He described the stop plainly, without embellishment or apparent resentment, stating clearly that his sole objective throughout the entire encounter had been to complete a routine citation safely and professionally, and that Vanessa Pruitt's repeated invocation of her Oversight Commission position had not changed his approach to the stop in any way, because, in his words, the law applies the same way to everyone regardless of what board they happen to sit on, a sentence I found myself quite genuinely admiring. We then played the bodycam footage in its entirety, all 11 minutes and 40 seconds of it, synchronized with a second angle from the backup officer's own camera once he arrived, and the courtroom, I will say honestly, sat in a particular kind of silence throughout, the silence that settles over a room watching a person's own recorded words and actions eliminate, in real time, every version of events their attorney had spent the morning attempting to construct. I asked Vanessa Pruitt directly, once she took the stand in her own defense, why she believed her position on the Oversight Commission entitled her to different treatment during a routine traffic stop than any other resident of this city would receive, and her answer, delivered with what I can only describe as genuine bewilderment at the question itself, was that she had spent 4 years reviewing officer conduct complaints, had personally recommended disciplinary action against several officers for what she considered excessive procedural rigidity, and had, over that time, come to believe, in her own words, that she understood policing well enough to know when a stop was unnecessary, a belief that had apparently calcified, over 4 years of sitting in judgment of officers from a position of institutional authority, into something considerably more dangerous, An assumption that her own judgment about the necessity of a given stop should override the officer's actual legal obligation to conduct it. I asked her whether, watching the footage played moments earlier, in my own courtroom, she still believed Officer Webb's conduct during that stop had been anything other than calm, professional, and procedurally correct, and she was quiet for a long moment before admitting on the record that watching it back, she could not identify a single point at which he had acted improperly, an admission her own attorney visibly wished she had not made so plainly. I asked her one further question before releasing her from the stand. I asked her whether she understood that a member of a civilian board specifically created to hold officers accountable for misconduct, threatening an officer's career during a routine stop in retaliation for that officer simply doing his job correctly, represented precisely the abuse of institutional power that board existed to prevent, and whether she saw the irony in that position. She did not have a ready answer to that question, which itself told me a great deal about how thoroughly the authority of her appointed position had, over 4 years, reshaped her understanding of her own accountability rather than sharpening it. The chief of police himself, a man named Raymond Ochoa, testified briefly regarding the department's internal review of the incident, and his testimony proved considerably more consequential to this case than a typical character witness statement, because Chief Ochoa testified that following Vanessa Pruitt's explicit threat to have Officer Webb removed from the force, delivered during an active traffic stop and captured on video, the department's Internal Affairs Division had, in fact, opened a formal review, though not of Officer Webb's conduct, which the footage plainly vindicated within days, but of Vanessa Pruitt's own fitness to continue serving on the Oversight Commission, given that a person who believed her appointed position entitled her to threaten officers acting entirely within procedure represented, in his words, exactly the kind of individual the Commission's own bylaws were designed to screen out, and that a formal recommendation for her removal from the board had already been submitted to the City Council independent of the outcome of this criminal case. When it came time for my ruling, I addressed Vanessa Pruitt directly and told her that the bodycam footage had eliminated any possible ambiguity about what occurred during that stop, that Officer Webb's conduct throughout the entire encounter, including the 4 minutes he waited calmly for backup rather than escalating physically after being shoved, represented exactly the kind of restraint every citizen of this city should expect and rarely receives adequate acknowledgement for, and that her own repeated invocation of an appointed civilian oversight position as a threat, rather than functioning as any kind of mitigating factor, instead represented a significant aggravating one, because it demonstrated a belief that institutional authority, however modest in actual legal power, entitled her to override an officer's lawful obligation to enforce the law equally. I found Vanessa Pruitt guilty of battery on a law enforcement officer, a charge her attorney had argued throughout the hearing should be reduced but which the bodycam footage supported without any meaningful ambiguity. I sentenced her to 30 days in the county correctional facility, a portion of which I suspended contingent on completion of 100 hours of community service. Hours I specified were to be completed working directly alongside the department's community outreach division, so that she might spend meaningful time, I told her plainly, observing the actual daily realities of the officers she had spent 4 years reviewing from behind a conference room table. I ordered a formal letter of apology to be delivered to Officer Webb personally, and I noted for the record, though it fell outside my own authority to order directly, that I found the department's independent recommendation for her removal from the Oversight Commission entirely appropriate given everything the footage had revealed. I turned to Officer Webb before the hearing concluded, and told him directly that this court recognized fully the restraint he had demonstrated across an encounter that would have tested the composure of considerably more experienced officers, and that the 4 minutes he spent waiting calmly for backup rather than escalating the situation himself represented, in my considerable experience reviewing use of force cases across 4 decades on this bench, close to a textbook example of exactly the kind of professional conduct citizens deserve and departments should actively work to cultivate and protect. Officer Webb, for his part, testified that he held no particular animosity toward Vanessa Pruitt personally, stating simply that he understood people say things in moments of anger and embarrassment that do not always reflect who they actually are, a sentiment I found, frankly, more generous than the circumstances strictly required, but one that spoke well of the kind of officer this department was fortunate to retain. Roughly 4 months after this hearing, my chambers received a brief note from Officer Webb's supervisor, informing the court that Officer Webb had since been promoted to a training role within the department, specifically tasked with mentoring new recruits on de-escalation techniques, a role the supervisor noted had been created in part because of the department's recognition of exactly the composure Officer Webb demonstrated throughout the incident that brought this case before me. And I think often about the particular danger of institutional authority when it is misunderstood by the very people entrusted to exercise it responsibly. Because Vanessa Pruitt did not walk into that traffic stop believing herself above the law in the way a wealthy heir or a powerful executive might, she walked into it believing, genuinely and mistakenly, that 4 years spent sitting in judgment of officers had transformed her into something closer to an extension of authority herself rather than a private citizen still fully bound by the same laws she reviewed others for allegedly violating, and that distinction, subtle as it may seem, represents one of the more instructive lessons this particular case leaves behind, that oversight and accountability only function honestly when the people entrusted to exercise them remain, at every moment, equally accountable themselves. And the instant a person appointed to hold power accountable begins to believe that appointment exempts them from accountability in their own conduct, the entire structure they were meant to protect begins, quietly at first and then very publicly, exactly as it did in a small rectangular device clipped to a patrol officer's chest on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, to fail.